CHAPA. Take it away, Lily.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, MHP, for having me today. As Christine said, today I'm going to be talking about how we can eliminate barriers to broader, more inclusive participation in community engagement. I am the MBTA Communities Engagement Manager at CHAPA, the Citizens Housing and Planning Association. Today, I'll start by giving a brief introduction to CHAPA for anyone who's not familiar and the Municipal Engagement Initiative, of which I am a part. I'm going to take you through a little bit of the research from Neighborhood Defenders, looking at our current representation in community meetings, digging into what barriers exist that prevent more inclusive participation, how we can address them. We'll be looking at a case study of some work we did in Chelsea last year, quick overview of the best practices at the end, and then hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A and discussion. So CHAPA's mission is to encourage the production and preservation of housing that is affordable to low and moderate income families and individuals, and to foster diverse and sustainable communities through planning and community development. We believe that Massachusetts should always be a place where our communities nourish us and help us grow. And right now, housing is the single best investment every community across the state can make to secure the future we all want and deserve. A diverse mix of homes in every part of Massachusetts plants the seeds of our long-term success by protecting our environment, improving our overall health, improving the quality of our children's education, strengthening our economy, and building wealth for everyone. The Municipal Engagement Initiative is the program within CHAPA that I am a part of. It was founded in 2018 in response to what we really saw as a lack of well-organized, well-resourced pro-housing coalitions on the ground. And so our program works to change the conversation and support existing local efforts. We recognize that every municipality is different and has its own unique challenges and opportunities. So we focus on bringing together broad, big tent coalitions to support housing. These coalitions really push beyond those usual suspects. You know, of course, we're expecting municipal staff, elected officials, housing advocates, developers, but we also want to bring in local business owners, civic groups like the League of Women Voters, service providers, faith groups, houses of worship, environmental and transit advocates, renters, cultural groups, racial justice advocates, and really anyone who believes that all people deserve safe, affordable, accessible housing. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the Neighborhood Defenders, which is a report that came out of Boston University by Dr. Catherine Einstein, David Glick, and Maxwell Palmer. And in this research process, they observed thousands of hours of public meetings on housing in Massachusetts. And what they found again and again is that attendees at these meetings do not represent the community as a whole. They are overwhelmingly older, whiter, more likely to be male, and more likely to be homeowners compared to the general population, and they are consistently there to oppose new developments. And these trends persist in both high and low cost cities. And opposition in wealthier neighborhoods often pushes development into lower income neighborhoods where people might not have the same capacity or ability to be as engaged. And this exacerbates gentrification and displacement. I highly recommend going to housingpolitics.com to check out more of the research, but I'll take you through a few quick data points now. You can see here they looked at the difference between commenters and registered voters. And it's important to note that, you know, registered voters don't necessarily represent the entire community. More generally, particularly, undocumented residents, people who are under the voting age, people who just simply aren't registered to vote. Maybe they moved there recently or they haven't done it yet. So we can see that women are underrepresented, white residents are overrepresented, and folks over 50 and homeowners are significantly overrepresented. And this has a major impact on the level of support that we're seeing, particularly for multifamily housing. You can see across all of the communities that they observed, even the ones with the highest levels of support could not quite get over that 50% threshold, which is really the bare minimum that we need to be able to see progress in our housing production. There's also significant differences in support by race and homeownership status. So we can see that white homeowners are one of the least likely groups to support new housing opportunities. White non-homeowners are slightly more likely, Black residents, both homeowners and non-homeowners, are significantly more likely than any other racial group to support new housing. But as we saw, they are frequently underrepresented in these meetings. So what are the barriers that are preventing more representative and inclusive participation in these meetings? How did we get to this point? It is often the people who would benefit most from new housing that are unable to participate. Some of these barriers include time, of course, work and family commitments. Many folks just cannot take an entire weeknight evening to go to city or town hall and participate in a public hearing. Insufficient outreach by the municipality, whether it's not doing enough direct outreach, not being creative with your outreach, using different platforms. Bureaucratic gatekeeping, it can often be really hard to navigate these different processes, particularly for larger, longer processes like a housing production plan, or if there's a major project development. There are many different steps, many different boards and committees that these need to move through, and it can be really hard to keep track of where in the process the town is, what's coming next, what opportunities to engage there are. And then just, of course, a lot of very technical language and jargon that can make it not very welcoming for people who are not entrenched in this work already. Language barriers are huge. If you don't provide translation and interpretation, people who don't speak English or don't feel confident in their English, particularly in the case of a public hearing, are just not going to participate. A sense of efficacy, or I should say a lack of a sense of efficacy, makes many people feel like, why should I take the time out of my day to go make a comment? I feel like town staff have already made up their mind and it's not worth my time. Harassment is unfortunately becoming an increasing issue, both harassment of town officials as well as other residents. And lastly, people may not currently live in that town, which makes them ineligible to comment, but want to move there, whether maybe they lived there before and they got priced out, they really want to come back, or maybe they live in an adjacent town, they have family in town, they'd love to be closer to, but because they don't currently live in town, their opinions aren't really taken into consideration. So when we're beginning our community engagement strategizing, we want to make sure that we're always starting with who is going to be the most impacted by this. And also, who have you struggled to engage in the past? Who have you not seen participating? And really pushing yourself to reach beyond those usual suspects that are always going to show up. So are you making sure to reach out to renters, people of color, young people, parents of young children, people with disabilities, people with low or no income, undocumented residents, non-English speaking residents, and residents of public and affordable housing are so often left out of these conversations, whether intentionally or not. So how can we eliminate some of these barriers? At first, through our communications and outreach efforts. I strongly recommend creating dedicated project web pages, whether it's a policy that you're looking to enact. Right now, many communities are in the process of implementing 3A, the MBTA multifamily zoning changes, having one place where people can consistently go to get updates. They don't have to bounce around the whole town page to find information scattered across different parts of the website, can be a really helpful and simple way to let people keep track of what's going on. Utilizing a variety of media to inform residents, so not just those web pages, but also social media, cable access, local papers. I know those are becoming increasingly rare, but if you have them, utilize them. Flyers, online forums, using a variety of digital and physical forms of outreach. Starting with strategic advocacy, outreach to known advocacy groups. So if you have a coalition, a housing coalition in your community, or a group that has a vested interest in this, has a certain level of knowledge and commitment to it, reaching out to those folks early on can really help you get a wider network of people that you can reach, as well as leaning on trusted organizations that might not be explicitly for housing, but thinking back to that Big Tent coalition model I talked about, faith groups, civic groups, cultural groups, social service organizations, thinking about who is doing this work on the ground in communities, who is trusted by the community, who is someone or an organization that when they speak, people listen and they take it seriously. Those are the folks you want to be really leaning on to get the word out to a broader group than the people who might already be directly engaged with the municipality. Meet people where they are, table or flyer at community events such as farmers markets, festivals, little league games. It's summertime. Summertime can often be a more difficult time to reach people and get them to show up to meetings, but there are a lot of community events. So I think it's the perfect time to get out of city or town hall and speak with people directly where they're already gathering. Translating materials into the most commonly spoken languages, of course, all your flyers, social media posts, any outreach that you're doing. Keeping your language concise and using visuals. So, if you have a flyer that's just a big block of text, people are gonna go right past it. Having something that will pop out at people, get their attention, give them the highlights, the most important pieces, and hopefully, pull them in to want to learn more. Creating a mailing list for people who are interested in a particular issue, where you can let them know we're going to have a meeting on this date and time to talk about this topic. Keeping them up to date as draft plans come out, as final decisions are being made. And if you make flyers or social media posts, including a QR code where people can register and sign up for the mailing list, or register for meetings or sign up for the mailing list. I think this is really helpful because if you see a flyer on the street, you might stop and think, oh, that's interesting. I'd like to learn more about that. But if there's no way to engage with it right there in the moment, you're going to lose people. They'll move on with their day and they'll forget about it. But if they can right there in the moment, they see the flyer, they're intrigued, they can pull out their phone, to use the QR code and sign up for the mailing list, then you've managed to kind of get them in that moment where their interest is piqued. So how can we eliminate some of these barriers through the way that we design our meetings? Offering multiple sessions on different days of the week and different times of day, I think is really important. Like I said, a lot of people can't make it out to a weeknight evening, so offering something on a Saturday morning. I've found that 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. on a Saturday is actually a time that works for a lot of people, particularly people with kids. Be thoughtful about the location where you're holding the meeting. Is it going to be an inviting location? So for example, holding a meeting at the library or an elementary school rather than a police station. There are residents who are just not going to feel comfortable walking into a police station. Is the location easy to access without a car? Do folks that use public transportation or walking, biking, are they going to be able to get there? And just simple things like providing signage so that when folks, particularly if it's a non-town hall location, people might not necessarily have never been there before, don't know their way around. So posting signs, directing people to where they need to go, making it as easy as possible for people to get there and to participate. Thinking about whether a virtual, in-person, or hybrid option makes most sense. I'm going to dig a little bit more into kind of some of the pros and cons of those later. And again, meeting people where they are. So going to those community events is a great way to do outreach, but you can also gather, sort of more informal public feedback through visioning exercises, interactive mapping activities, brief surveys, and most importantly, conversation. I think I really can't overemphasize the value of taking the time to speak one-on-one with people, hear them out, hear their concerns, hear their ideas. I think it goes a long way in terms of building trust and just having a deeper understanding of where folks are coming from and why they might have the perspective that they do. Providing resources that enable broader, more equitable participation. Food is obviously critical for people who are food insecure, but even for those who aren't, it's certainly a benefit and can be a draw for people. Childcare is extremely important for parents, particularly single parents. No one should have to hire a babysitter to be able to come to a public hearing. Translation and interpretation, and stipends for participation. Even a modest gift card can make a big difference for people. And set the stage for success. Provide fact sheets with some of the basic background that people would need to meaningfully participate in a meeting. Providing a clear explanation of the process, like what are we here to do? What are the goals of today? What's on the table, what's not on the table? I think we've all been in meetings where people, show up wanting to talk about something different or show up wanting to ask questions when it's actually a public hearing. Letting people know what can you actually expect out of this time here today so that folks don't feel disappointed or like they're having trouble following what the expectations are. And creating a code of conduct or a set of group agreements. So what are the expectations of how we're going to behave in this space, how we treat each other? And I'm going to give some examples of each of these, the fact sheets, the explanation about the process, and the code of conduct. So these are some really simple fact sheets that we have made for different events over the past few years. All of these were made using Canva. As you can see, they're quite simple. They're not winning any graphic design awards, but they get the job done of getting this information across. So on the left, you can see a template that I've created for a basic, what is affordable housing in your town? How many, most people don't actually know what the technical definition of affordable housing is. So we want to make sure that we're explaining that. What share of renters and homeowners are currently struggling to pay their housing costs? Looking at what are people in town making right now? A first-year public school teacher, a job at a local business, something in service or retail. And taking the time to calculate, well, if this is their salary, at 30% of their gross income, what would they be able to afford per month or per year? And then on the other side of this sheet, which you can't see here, I break down, well, what are the current housing costs? And then you can see how those very often do not match up. We have a sheet covering some really basic facts about accessory dwelling units that you can see are both in English and Spanish. And then an FAQ that I put together or supported our Foxborough Housing Coalition in putting together. These answers were provided by the school administration, which I think it can be really valuable to have kind of a neutral third party helping to create these fact sheets. School admins don't necessarily have any vested interest in creating more housing. And so being able to say like, look, the folks in charge of the schools are telling us that school enrollment is not something we have to worry about, I think can be really helpful for assuaging people's fears. And again, just trying to keep those responses as concise as possible. It should be something people can easily kind of look down and reference as they're participating in the meeting. Some suggested, oh, did I skip a slide? No. Some suggested group agreements. Be fully present in the space. If you're in person, that means no screens. If you are virtual, turning your camera on. Using I statements. So, we can only speak from our unique perspective. Take space, make space is a little snappy way to remind people that if you are doing a lot of talking, maybe take a beat, give other people the chance to talk. If you haven't said anything yet, try to get your voice in there as well. Share the lesson, not the story. So if you want to share, maybe something personal about a friend who's struggling with housing affordability, rather than giving specific personal information about that person, share the takeaway from that story so that we're not sharing anyone's personal information without permission. And this also applies to, if people are sharing personal information within that meeting, respecting that privacy when you leave and not sharing that without their permission. Assume good intent. A lot of these meetings can get pretty contentious. These are very emotional issues. And certainly if someone is behaving in a way that is inappropriate or disrespectful, we need to call that out. And I'll talk about that in a little bit, but giving people the benefit of the doubt. No one knows everything, but together we know a whole lot. And think outside the box and dream big. It can be easy to get bogged down in all the nitty-gritty details of what is currently on the ground. So encouraging people to try to think beyond that, really, follow their wildest dreams. Setting clear ground rules, stating them explicitly at the very beginning. posting them somewhere, whether it's, if you're in person, physically on a wall or virtually, putting it in the chat, making sure you're explaining explicitly, what is this meeting about? What is the agenda? What can you expect to happen tonight? What are the goals? By the end of this meeting, what do we hope to have accomplished? These meetings are almost always part of a larger process. I don't think I've ever been to a community meeting that's just a one-off. We got all of our answers in this one evening. So, step out for people. Where are you in this process? What comes next? What has already happened? Who is facilitating the meeting and why? What is the relationship between those running the meeting and the project policy initiative that's being discussed, making it clear what your role in the process is. Maybe you're a decision maker, maybe you're a facilitator. Letting people know, who they're talking to. Managing expectations. Will there be time for questions? Are we going to do public comment? Acknowledging tensions that may already exist going into the meeting. As I said, a lot of these meetings can be really emotional. I think it's helpful to just acknowledge that and referring back to these ground rules if you feel like they've been violated or need to be clarified. How can we prevent discrimination in these processes? Because it's one thing to get people to show up, but how can we assure that once they're there, the decisions that we're making are not being driven by discrimination? Be sure that you know the protected classes in Massachusetts. So race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, disability, source of income. Landlords cannot discriminate against someone who has a Section 8 voucher. Sexual orientation, gender identity, age, veteran or active military status, and marital status. And are you asking yourself, are the potential impacts on protected classes being discussed and given their due consideration in this process? Are you creating an environment where people who fall under a protected class would feel comfortable speaking in that space? Ensuring that the decisions being made are not guided by discrimination, which will often take the form of coded language about schools, home values, crime and safety, or referring to existing public or deed restricted affordable housing as an example of the worst case scenario. I think it's important to have an ear out for this coded language because of course while people may not necessarily recognize that those thoughts are driven by discrimination, we know that in many cases they are. And being prepared to respond if you do hear these kinds of comments. And when overt discriminatory comments are made, they need to be addressed outright. So in the case of some of those more covert comments about things like home values, school enrollment, starting by asking for further clarification, because it's possible that the person just didn't maybe explain themselves very well, giving them the chance to elaborate a little bit on what they really mean. But we never repeat the discriminatory statement, even if it's just to disagree with it. We should not be, repeating that language. Finding something within the statement that you can agree on as a kind of bridge, and then refocusing to the conversation at hand. So for example, if someone says, I don't want affordable housing next to me because it's going to bring crime to the neighborhood, we can say something like, I agree that public safety is a top priority and everyone deserves to live in a home where they feel safe. Providing stable housing for those struggling with housing affordability is a critical step to improve public safety, public health and safety for everyone. And that is why we are pursuing more housing. And take note as you hear these things come up so that you can follow up on this misinformation in future meetings and get ahead of it. For more overt comments, such as slurs, hate speech, stereotyping, harassment, we have to address the comment directly. This type of speech is not acceptable. It should not be tolerated. Have a plan for how you might handle situations if they do escalate. Having a designated de-escalator who is comfortable in that role, I think is recommended so that if something like that comes up, you know whose job it is, you don't have to kind of panic in the moment. And we don't want to just brush over it and move on. We have to take a moment to acknowledge what has happened, what impact it may have had on the other people in the room, giving people the chance to speak to how it affected them. And I think particularly touching base privately afterwards with anyone who may have been affected, whether that speech was directed at them or at a group of which they are a part. It's a critical moment to repair, because if we kind of brush over these things, don't acknowledge them, don't take that moment for repair, I feel fairly confident in saying that person is never going to come back to another meeting. They will not feel safe participating in these meetings. I'll talk a bit about event formats and equity implications. Apologies, I have no idea where this green line came from. It's not part of my slides. Open public meetings. The benefits of these are that they have a broader reach. You can disseminate information widely, get direct feedback from people. If done well, they can be an opportunity for transparency and trust building. And they generally are a little less intensive to plan than some of the other forms of community engagement. But the challenges are that public hearings can be nerve-wracking for people who are new to advocacy. There are many barriers to attendance. The barriers that I listed at the beginning, I would say pretty much all of them are applicable here. No way to know who will show up if you will get truly representative participation, and they can be difficult to contain if things get rowdy. I'm sure all of us, if we haven't personally experienced it, have seen videos of public meetings that have really gotten out of control. Panels, forums, and webinars are an excellent educational tool for informing the public, doing more of a kind of deep dive informational session about these topics. Having outside experts can create a little space for planning staff. So thinking back to that, the benefit of that neutral third party of, maybe you don't trust town staff, maybe you think we have an agenda, but this person is just here to share their expertise. And you can record the event and post it on that webpage that I know you've all made for future use. So as new people come into the fold, they have that to reference as well. Challenges are that depending on the topic, the panelist, and the format, you may fail to reach beyond the usual suspects. So just like we want to see representation in the meeting participants, we also want to see that on any kind of panel or forum that we might put together. So if it's a panel that consists entirely of straight white men, we're likely not going to bring new, more inclusive participation. They can be more intensive to plan, coming up with the panelists, reaching out to them, finding a time that works for all of them, meeting ahead with them to run through the conversation that you want to have. And live interpretation can be a little more tricky if you have a lot of different people all talking at the same time. It just takes a little bit of planning of how you want to handle that interpretation. Interactive events are an amazing way to solicit direct community input on specific questions and concerns. It's a great way to build community amongst residents, neighbors meeting neighbors, having these conversations face-to-face, trust building between municipality and residents, and hands-on activities are just a really important educational tool. Most people learn better when they're actively engaged in something rather than just passively listening. It is definitely probably the most time intensive for staff. You need to set up, there's often a lot of different materials. If you're having a facilitated activity, you'll probably need more staff to be able to lead those activities. And it is more costly, particularly if you want to provide food, childcare, translation, et cetera, which I particularly recommend for more interactive events. Focus groups. The benefit of focus groups is that it can provide an opportunity for intentional outreach towards impacted groups. You could create affinity groups, for example, have a focus group that's all renters, a focus group that's all Black residents, a focus group that's all young people. And this can be a safe space for marginalized people who might feel uncomfortable in a larger public meeting due to fear of harassment, to be able to have those honest, more in-depth conversations. Some of the challenges is that you're probably going to hear some pushback from those usual suspects who are used to being the loudest voice in the room. I don't think that's a reason not to do it, but it's just something to anticipate. There is the potential for unintended bureaucratic gatekeeping. These are smaller, you're not going to reach as many people, but it's sort of a quality over quantity question. And they are certainly time intensive because these are typically, probably 2-hour conversations, and you have to have quite a few of them. Surveys are a nice kind of simple way to do broad engagement. They're easy to disseminate. You can use all those different channels to get it out to people. Folks can participate on their own time. Typically these surveys that I've seen are 10, 15 minutes at most to fill out. Translation is relatively straightforward. The challenges are that it does provide a fixed menu of options, so it's difficult for residents to express more nuanced ideas or personal experiences. So you want to be thoughtful about where in the process are you utilizing this survey. Maybe it's at the beginning, just to kind of get a big picture sense of where is the conversation at now. Maybe it's at the end, once you've narrowed down to a set of options based off of your previous community engagement. But we want to be sure that surveys are being used in addition to these other kinds of events and not in place of them. And there's no guarantee it will be representative of the community. I do recommend on these surveys asking people to share information about their racial identity, their homeownership status, their age group, so you can see, these responses that we're getting, how representative are they actually of the community? And are you seeing trends of, support or opposition amongst different groups? As we are planning and thinking through these various event options, we also want to be thoughtful about the format that we're choosing. So virtual meetings have become pretty ubiquitous in our lives. We're all pretty accustomed to them now. They are easier for some people to attend, like parents of young children. They can cook dinner, put the kids to bed while they're attending. And it will increase participation for some, but not necessarily new people. I'm sorry to say that our neighborhood defenders research friends went back and redid some of this research during the first year of the pandemic as we were switching to Zoom, and they found that it did not meaningfully change who was showing up. I think it just means that people who are already engaged might attend more frequently because it's a little easier to do so. You can provide live translation through Zoom, which is a great feature, and closed captioning for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. It is less accessible for many older adults. They tend not to prefer virtual meetings. And of course, it's not accessible for people who do not have internet access, which is still 15% of Massachusetts does not have internet access. In-person meetings are an amazing opportunity for community connection and trust building. Nothing beats that face-to-face, which is why I'm so excited to see many of you tomorrow face-to-face. They are often preferred by older adults. You can utilize existing spaces at no cost. You don't have to pay for a Zoom account or anything like that. And they are more interactive. You can be a little bit more creative with your meeting design and structure. Of course, there are still health concerns, particularly for immunocompromised people. It's less accessible for people with young children, people without cars, people who might have some issue with physically getting to the site, people with mobility issues. Live translation and closed captioning require special equipment. So you can't just use a little Zoom feature, you have to have the headsets. So it's just another factor to consider. And then hybrid meetings. The benefit is that you're able to serve a larger group in one event, those who want to stay home and those who want to come in person. But there are, I would say, in my opinion, they are more difficult technically to be able to set up. So they are definitely the most time intensive of all the options. You need, particular equipment, multiple staff members, someone running the screens in person, someone running the slides over Zoom. If you're having live interpretation and Zoom interpretation, microphones, you might need a camera. It's just more equipment that you do need to have, and I think in order to really pull it off effectively. And in my experience, for folks joining virtually, they don't get quite the same quality of experience as the people in person. So it is my personal recommendation to do 2 separate events, one in person and one virtual, so that each group can kind of get the full quality of that experience. That being said, MAPC has put together an amazing hybrid engagement hub that will give you all kinds of tips and tricks for how to effectively pull off hybrid meetings. So lastly, I'm going to do a quick time check because I know we started a little late. I'm going to talk about our Chelsea case study. So this was a series of sessions that we did with, in collaboration with the City of Chelsea, and with some community organizations, including Green Roots, the neighborhood developers, and La Collaborativa. And this was all about educating the public on zoning, bringing new voices into the conversation, and ultimately putting together a new zoning proposal that was truly equity driven. Some of the ways that we work to eliminate barriers to participation, including holding the sessions at night at a local middle school, at a space that would hopefully be inviting and familiar to people. We provided a full meal at all 4 sessions that was catered by a local restaurant. There was on-site childcare at all 4 sessions. So we saw kids from probably 3 to 12 participating. They had different activities. We offered live interpretation. There were also bilingual facilitators. And I think it's important to differentiate because an interpreter is just repeating what the facilitator or moderator said, but in another language. Bilingual facilitators enabled, these small group conversations across languages. In some cases, we had mixed language tables. In other cases, we had Spanish language tables and English language tables. But being someone who has both the skills of a facilitator and a translator is very, very helpful. We provided $50 stipends at every session, and we also sent out bilingual reminder texts and emails. So we let people tell us, there was a form where they gave us their contact information. They let us know if we had permission to reach out to them, and if they did, how would they prefer to be reached? And I think that taking that time to remind people of the dates, when the next session was, what it was going to be about, made a big difference because we had 80+ participants at every session, and the majority of participants attended multiple or even all 4 sessions. So we had a lot of people coming back each time. Session 1 was a really basic overview of Zoning 101. We did an overview of the goals of this workshop series. Remember that kind of level setting. What are the expectations? What are we hoping to accomplish here? There was a presentation on the history of zoning in Chelsea and just zoning more broadly. Why does zoning exist? What are the benefits of it? We discussed some key historical events and how they have impacted housing in Chelsea today. Patterns of migration. Chelsea had a series of pretty severe fires in the 20th century, redlining, and the receivership that the city went through in the 90s. And then we had small group discussions on how these decisions have impacted people's lives. What is their current experience of housing in Chelsea, that of their peers? We handed out feedback forms at every session where we had some prompts asking people, what did you learn? Was there anything surprising to you? What do you still have questions about? Some questions that related to the topic of the session that day. And then we were able to address those questions, things that people didn't feel like we got to in that session at future sessions. That was also how we collected folks' contact information for future outreach. And these were filled out both in English and Spanish. And so then we had to obviously have the Spanish ones translated as well. Session 2 was on zoning policy solutions. So we started with a presentation on what zoning can and can't accomplish. And that was in many ways a direct response to what we found at the first session, where folks came in with all kinds of questions and concerns around housing. They wanted to talk about rent control. They wanted to talk about overcrowding in housing. They wanted to talk about creating single room occupancy housing for single people who maybe came to Chelsea to work and aren't living with a family. And so we wanted to make it clear to people, what are we actually going to be able to accomplish in these sessions and what is the specific issue we're trying to solve. Those other things are all very important. They need to be addressed, but this is just about zoning. We looked at some different policy solutions like Boston's affirmatively furthering fair housing, Cambridge's affordable housing overlay zoning, accessory dwelling units, and parking relief, and dug into, you may recall that fact sheet example I gave. that had the ADU really just bullet point, high level facts in English and Spanish. That was from this session. So we had a sheet like that for each of these different policy solutions. And then again, we had small group discussions on what people love about Chelsea, what they would like to see change, and their thoughts on the policies that we had explored together. And then you can see in the photo, we had sticky boards where people answered these prompts, and bilingual facilitators took detailed notes on all of the conversations that they had. Session 3, we had a really fun interactive game that was led by the neighborhood developers. Folks split into groups, and each group was given a real parcel in the city and told to build whatever they want. So they had an aerial photo of the parcel, and we said to, dream big, no limits. You can build anything from your wildest imagination. So different Legos, the different colors represented commercial, residential, open space, parking. And of course, the group had to collaborate. Not everyone in each group wanted exactly the same thing, but they were encouraged to really build it as big and high and whatever they wanted. And then afterwards, each group shared their design with the broader group and explained their choices. What did they build? Why? What is the value in it to them? Then we gave them the existing zoning rules for that parcel and asked them to build a new structure within those limitations. And as you can probably imagine, people were very surprised and frustrated by how much the zoning limited them, having to give up affordability, having to give up green space because of parking requirements. And I think this was really helpful to illuminate for people the real confinement that zoning can create, exclusionary zoning can create when we're not shaping our zoning to really encourage the kind of development that we want to see. At our final session, we dug more into what people do want to see built in the city of Chelsea. So participants were split into small groups and given a stack of images of existing homes, commercial buildings, parks. You can see in the picture that stack of images. City staff and folks from some of those community organizations walked around and took pictures of different properties in the city. And we asked people to sort these images into yes and no piles for what they want to see more or less of in the city. And each group discussed why they liked or disliked various pictures, because of course, not everyone in every group had the same perspective. So it was an opportunity to dig into, well, why do you like this type of development, but not that? Bilingual facilitators led small group discussions on the built environment and what zoning or other policies are needed to make participants' dreams possible. So, if folks really liked, a larger 8-unit apartment building, talking about all the places in town that just wouldn't be possible to build. And then city staff wrapped up this last session by sharing next steps, explaining how all of this information would be incorporated into the final zoning, talking a little bit about the process to come to really help illuminate for people what role they were playing in that process and what they could expect to happen next. So we learned a lot from these sessions, but some of our key takeaways were just how important partnering with trusted local community organizations is. Green Roots, La Colaborativa, they have deep, deep ties in the community. They're trusted by the community. And I think that really was demonstrated in the number of participants that we had and the diversity of participants that we had. About 80% of folks who attended were non-English speaking. And that is very rare compared to what I've experienced at most other processes like this. Creative hands-on activities combined with small group discussions enabled a deeper level of participation and trust building. We tried to spend as little time talking at people as possible. Of course, we want to do that level setting, make sure we have a shared knowledge that we can utilize to have more productive conversations. But we really wanted to spend most of our time engaging people in more hands-on activities. People will often come to these meetings wanting to talk about something else. Like I said earlier, people wanted to talk about rent control. They wanted to talk about overcrowded housing. And, we need to keep the meeting on track, make sure that people understand what we're there to accomplish. But it's also important to take the time to speak with them one-on-one to really hear them out. We had many, staff and participants on site because we were working with so many different community organizations. And that made it possible for, both after and as the sessions were going on to have those one-on-one conversations and hear what people are concerned about. I think it does a lot for trust building and to demonstrate that people are listening and really do care about what folks on the ground are experiencing. It's also important to remember that people understand what they want to see in their community. They don't need to have an urban planning degree or to know all the jargon to be able to describe it. But visuals can be really key to bridging that gap and helping people understand how, what they love about their community, what they want to see in their community, how we can help actually realize that through this planning and these various policies. These kinds of events are time intensive to set up. Give yourself at least 90 minutes. You have to set up the food, the childcare, all the tables. If you're doing a slideshow, if you have interpretation, testing out the headsets and making sure that they're working. And then of course there's the event itself, the wrap up at the end. So all in all, you might be looking at 4 or 5 hours for this event. Like I said, these interactive kind of sessions are definitely more time intensive, but I think the quality of information that you get really does make it worth it. Create a run of show, particularly if you're working with a lot of different people like we were, so everyone knows what they're doing and when. So we had a little document that broke down, from 6 p.m. to 6:30, we're going to have food. These people should be monitoring the food table, making sure that it's clean, that people have what they need. These people should be signing folks in. These people should be, touching base with the interpreters. From this time to this time, this person's going to give an introduction. This activity is going to last for this long. And everyone who is facilitating or helping to run the event had a copy of that run of show so that we could make sure to stay on schedule and make sure people knew what they should be doing and when. I highly, if you're, coordinating a dozen plus people, I think it's really necessary to do something like that. Set up the childcare ideally within view, but far enough away to not be a distraction. So in our case, the childcare was, probably only 20 or 30 feet away on the other side of the cafeteria, which is where this event was being hosted. So people could see their kids and know that they were safe, but but still be able to focus on the activity in front of them. The feedback forms were so helpful for gauging the success of the event. Did people really understand what we were trying to get across to them? What questions do they still have that we need to address in future sessions? And of course, collecting that contact information. We provided stipends at the end of the evening to incentivize people to stay for the entire event. It would be easy enough if you give it out at the beginning for someone to come and get it and leave. And at the end of the day, truly equitable community engagement is time consuming and it is often expensive, but it is so, so important to really be able to see more equitable outcomes in our planning processes. So in conclusion, these are some of my top takeaways that I hope you take from today. Understand your community context. Who are the usual suspects? I think every community probably has those 6 to 12 people that you can count on to show up at every meeting, whether they're, supportive or opponents. Who is missing and who is going to be most impacted? If we're going to be doing strategic outreach, who are the groups that we need to hear from most? Build partnerships with trusted community organizations. Like I said, having Green Roots and La Colaborativa involved in that process in Chelsea made all the difference. I feel very confident that if it had just been CHAPA and city staff, we would not have seen the turnout that we did. Learn from and with underrepresented communities, not just about them. So it's simple enough to look at the data, but if we're not engaging in these conversations and really upholding people's lived experiences as valuable information that we need to be paying attention to and having drive these processes, we are not going to have the equitable outcomes that we want to see. Meeting people where they are, I'll say that again and again and again. If you bring this information to people and make it as easy for them as possible to know what's going on, you are going to reach a much broader group than if you are just assuming that people will come to you actively seeking out the information. Make no assumptions about what people do or don't know. We really push people to, if you're going to use some kind of technical term, explain it. Just say a couple sentences about what that means. If you're going to use an acronym, spell out what that acronym means. It can be so easy, most of us spend so much of our days talking to other planners, other policy professionals. It's easy to forget that most people do not know what an ADU is, do not know what AMI means. So just taking that extra couple seconds to explain it to people so they can meaningfully participate. And also it can be really alienating if you show up to a meeting and you have no idea what anyone's talking about. It often makes people feel like they shouldn't speak because it's like, if I don't know what anyone's talking about, how could I possibly meaningfully contribute? Set yourself up for success by setting clear expectations, having those that code of conduct, provide resources that make participation not just possible, the interpretation, the food, the childcare, but easy and even fun. Ideally, we want to make these actually enjoyable experiences for people. That's going to get them to come back next time. Getting creative, thinking beyond the traditional public meeting that we are all very well versed in. And remembering that this is a practice. If these are not things that you have been utilizing on a regular basis, it is going to take some time. Don't feel like you need to do it all at once, but focusing on what can you do right now? What do you have the capacity from? What do you have the staff for? Where do you need to focus your energy? I know that most municipal staff are stretched so thin. You're working on so many different projects. And so I don't want this to feel like another big stressful thing on your to-do list. But hopefully can give you some ideas and some inspiration for how you might be able to continue to improve. So with that, I would love to open it up to questions. I see a lot in the chat. So I don't know if my friends at MHP want to feed some to me because I don't think I can scroll through all 37 at one time.
Hey, Lily, this is Katie Lacey.
Hi, Katie.
That was amazing. There are so many questions, but I will say we are fortunate that we had an amazing audience who promptly answered half the questions, taking you off the hook. Starting with a question from Taylor Robinson about how can we engage affordable housing opponents? And the participants had fantastic solutions. But I think that's always an issue. And you also continued to talk about that, sort of people who were just not interested or they're opposed to it. How can you bring them in?
Yeah, I think that could actually be a really good use of the focus group. I think the tricky part of giving too much of a platform to people who are opposed to housing is you're just amplifying that message further and further. But of course, we can't ignore it. We know that it exists. These folks are residents too. They have a right to express their opinion, but I think a focus group could be a nice opportunity to be able to really dig into this with people to understand the why behind their opposition. Ultimately, there are some folks that we are never, ever going to reach. And they will never change their minds. And so for them, really the best we can hope for is try to maintain, a friendly civil relationship, acknowledge that, we recognize them, we appreciate their feedback. But for those who I think their opposition comes more from just a place of misunderstanding, most people are not taking the time to really deeply educate themselves on these topics. And a lot of them are quite complex. There is no silver bullet to address our housing shortage. So I think taking the time to educate people, to allay some of their fears with those fact sheets and your broader education efforts can hopefully, if done well, be successful at shifting the outlook of people who are kind of in that middle range. Like they could be moved, but they are currently maybe being influenced by opponents at present. But I do think for people who are staunchly opposed, having some of those more one-on-one conversations can be a good way to really dig into what is really at the core of that opposition.
Don't want to forget, there's a lot of interest in the zoning game and what materials were used, who paid for those materials. Clearly there was a lot of interest in that.
Awesome. Yeah, it was a great session. I would absolutely do that again and recommend for anyone to do it. Like I said, the neighborhood developers facilitated this. This is something that they've done at a number of events. So I would definitely recommend reaching out to them if you want to do this for yourself. But honestly, the materials were relatively simple. They had a lot of Legos. They had those little, Lego bases. And there was a kind of a quick explanation of the game. Yellow represents commercial, green represents open space, blue represents housing. How many, each dot on the Lego represented like 25 square feet, I think. So just some really basic kind of outline for the initial process. And then there was a sheet that was handed out that gave just kind of the basics for the zoning of that particular parcel, like height requirements, any setback requirements, parking requirements. So obviously we're not going to hand people the full zoning atlas and expect them to go through it. But since we were working with real parcels from the city, they were able to just really concisely kind of give the most important parameters for the zoning of that particular parcel. So yeah, I mean, that's the basic really. And then we also had a sheet that broke down, and I think this was really helpful for people, the cost of building a unit of housing and how much the cost per unit goes down the more units you're able to build. And I think that was a really helpful, the sheet that we had said that the average to build one unit is about $800,000. And so I think that was really like mind-blowing for people, and kind of helped illuminate like, oh yeah, when we can only build single family housing, it's going to be more expensive. But the more units we're able to build, the lower the cost per unit will be to build them. Therefore, we should be able to rent them or sell them for a lower cost. So I think having that breakdown and how that played into the affordability piece was also really important for people.
Awesome. I'm gonna I think we have time for one more, and I'm wondering if you can maybe close your presentation so we can get the whole group in here. This is a tough one that we got. Someone saying, what other academic research could support your work? Now, I don't expect you to answer this right away, but I think someone is putting out a nice offer here. And I know, for instance, that the BU work has just been phenomenally useful. But if anything comes to mind, if not, we can just skip to the next thing.
Yeah, I think that's, when it comes to quantitative data, like hard numbers on the representation that we're seeing right now, I don't have any other studies I can pull from the top of my head, but I would say that it's sort of scattered information. As you look at the broader terrain, there might not be like one major study that's kind of summarizing all of it, but I think there are so many groups. Dr. Tiffany Manuel and the Case Made have been an amazing resource to CHAPA, looking at how does the way that we talk about housing impact the kind of people that we reach and the outcomes that we get. There's an amazing group that has been really inspiring to me called The Untokening, which is a group of transportation planners who are majority people of color, LGBTQ+, and they have created this group that is really for them, and that can be a safe space for them to have these conversations, talk about the unique experience of being a planner in this field who is a person of color. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of different, the Thrivance group is an amazing group in California that's doing work all around what they call dignity infused planning, really uplifting the lived experience of people on the ground who are directly dealing with housing insecurity, with traffic violence. So there are certainly, I think, for me, I've gotten a lot of my inspiration from nonprofits, consulting organizations, individuals. Tamika Butler has been an amazing resource for me. So I tend towards drawing my inspiration from community organizations rather than academic institutions, because the people who are doing the work on the ground, I think, have a very rich, nuanced understanding and often a personal lived experience of how this impacts our communities. And so I generally kind of turn to community organizations over academia.
Well, we're getting some great suggestions in the chat that other people are copying down. Maybe we should copy this chat.
Yeah.
We're just about out of time. I'm going to, personally ask a question, just reading the paper lately and the meetings in Burlington, and, how are we going to proceed in a climate of fear at this point for people? Do you have any words of wisdom for sort of keeping the temperature down? Different times.
Yeah, I mean, I could certainly do a whole other session. We actually did this with the Municipal Engagement Initiative about how to handle these difficult meetings. So that's a whole other, I know the Massachusetts Municipal Association actually just had a session on this the other day. I haven't gotten the chance to watch it yet. It was at the same time as a meeting I was hosting, but I definitely plan on watching that as well. Honestly, the first thing that comes to mind is taking care of yourself and taking care of your staff. This work can be hard. It can get really personal, particularly in smaller communities. I've worked with many planners who have been villainized by their own neighbors. And I think it's important to recognize that that is hard, that is draining, it's emotionally challenging, it can get very personal. And so taking the time to take care of yourself, take care of your staff, try to manage burnout, I think, is so important, because if we don't do that, we're going to see turnover. We're going to see this kind of revolving door of new staff members. And that can be a real deterrent to trust building. Having, if we can retain our planners, and I think that long-term is going to have much better outcomes. So talk to your staff, check in on them, make sure they are okay, make sure you're not over committing yourself. I think if we are coming from a place of groundedness, we will be better prepared to handle these things as they come up. Ultimately, we can't control how other people behave, but if we are able to fill our own cup and come into these spaces with kind of compassion to share, I think that we'll be much better set up to be able to handle those unpleasant moments when they come.
Well, that is great advice for life to carry us forward. So thank you so much, Lily. And we'll see this group back in